Hey there. Tonight you're not falling asleep to dragons or war drums, but to something far quieter and far more unsettling. We're about to turn the pages of one of Europe's strangest and darkest chapters, when love was set aside for politics, and royal daughters were expected to marry. Men who shared their blood, not just once, but for generation after generation. Tonight you'll follow the lives of young women born to be daughters of kings, but never quite allowed to be anything else. Their faces were lovely, their gowns exquisite, and their destinies almost always decided before their first steps. But that's not the whole story. And maybe, just maybe by the time you drift off, you'll feel what they rarely could comfort: safety, choice. If these soft history journeys help ease your mind at night, you're welcome to like and subscribe, but only if it truly adds peace to your evening. And if you're listening from somewhere unusual tonight, I'd love to know, what city are you in, and how late is it for you? It's always comforting to imagine us as one quiet circle of listeners, scattered across time zones and tucked beneath different blankets. Ready? Then close your eyes, dim the lights, and let's begin with a girl. Not just any girl, but one wrapped in velvet, and politics born not to dream but to marry. You're standing now in a grand hall somewhere in early 16th century Europe. The floors are polished stone cold underfoot, even through silk slippers. Heavy tapestries hang from the walls, scenes of falcon hunts and family crests, but their colors have already started to fade like the faces in the portraits above. Somewhere behind a half-open door, a choir is rehearsing for the feast. It's not your birthday. It's your betrothal day. You're 13, maybe 14. You've just been handed a small silver mirror by your lady-in-waiting, who smiles tightly as if to say, this is what you have now: beauty, silence, and obedience. Your name may as well be erased. It matters less than your lineage. You're the third daughter of a second cousin to the emperor, and your destiny has already been dictated by a council of men who speak of you as the Lisbon offer, or the Vienna solution, depending on which throne needs stabilizing. It's not that they mean you harm exactly. It's just that they don't see you, not the you with cold feet and a nervous stomach. They see a treaty in a dress. This was the fate of royal daughters across Europe in the 1500s. Born into privilege, yes, but also born into a trap. Love was for lesser people. Your worth was not measured in who you were, but in how well your blood could reinforce a dynasty. Cousin to cousin, niece to uncle, child to adult. It all made sense on parchment. Family trees weren't trees at all back then. They were circles, loops, tangles that ensured no castle, no land, and no crown ever left the hands of the family. Even if it meant those hands started to tremble with illness, deformity, or grief. Historians agree over 80% of marriages in Europe's ruling families during the 16th century were between blood relatives. First cousins, double cousins, uncles to nieces, sometimes even aunt to nephew if the politics aligned. The reason was painfully simple. If you marry someone outside your royal house, you risk your heirs growing up under someone else's roof, someone else's influence. And that to monarchs was far more terrifying than a few congenital disorders. You might assume this sort of thing happened in secret, but it didn't. It was celebrated. Portraits were commissioned, ballads composed. The betrothal of a girl to her cousin was often cause for fireworks, not concern. It wasn't even just accepted, it was applauded. A tidy little victory for the kingdom's bloodline, a promise that no foreign hand would meddle in succession. And you, the girl in the middle of it all, were expected to smile, to curtsy, to bleed when told and give birth when commanded. But what they didn't know, or refused to know, was what happened behind the tapestries. When the dresses came off and the nosebleeds began. When young brides fainted after walking too far, or couldn't conceive no matter how often they were summoned. They didn't know how much it hurt to carry a child you loved only to lose it, and then be told to try again before your body had healed. Because duty waits for no mourning. And so it was that royal daughters became both currency and casualties. Their names faded while their faces repeated, because the gene pool wasn't a pool at all. It was a glass of water stirred with the same spoon over and over. You'll meet many of them tonight, some adored, some forgotten, all caught in a cycle they never asked to join. And perhaps the saddest part is that they were trained to accept it. From infancy, royal girls were raised with a whisper in their ear. You are not a child, you are a vessel. Every book you read, every language you learn, every embroidery stitch you perfect, these are not for your pleasure, but to make you more desirable. Not to a lover, to a kingdom. You might wonder, did any of them rebel? Did any of these daughters throw a hairbrush across the room and scream that they were not pawns? Some did in quiet ways. One duchess famously insisted on eating dinner alone for weeks after being forced into marriage. Another carried a personal book of prayers in which she wrote carefully, and in Latin, "Let no girl suffer as I did." But such protests rarely stopped anything. They were like gusts of wind against stone towers, brief, emotional, and ultimately dismissed. Still, their resistance lives on in odd places. In the way, one princess arranged her furniture backward, so she never had to look her husband in the eye. In the stories of another, who slept with a dagger under her pillow, not for defense, but as a symbol of her unfinished freedom. These small gestures weren't loud enough to echo through history textbooks, but they were real, and in a way they speak more clearly than any royal edict or war victory ever could. Even now, centuries later, their echoes remain. In archives where their names are marked with a single line in medical journals, where their family trees are used as case studies for inbreeding depression, in portraits where their eyes seem just a little too far apart, their mouths held just a little too stiff. Some scholars still debate whether these physical traits were exaggerated by painters to hint at illness, or whether they were simply recorded with brutal honesty. One quirky fact: many royal girls in the Habsburg line were required to have their teeth examined before engagement contracts were finalized. Not for beauty, but to estimate how many children they could reasonably survive giving birth to. If your gums bled easily or your bite looked weak, you might be quietly passed over. Or worse, matched to someone even more inbred. Because what did it matter anyway? Of course, all of this assumes that you survived to marriage. Many daughters didn't. They died of fever or childbirth or a fall down an unlit stone stairwell before they even turned 18. And still their sisters followed in line, stepping into the same cycle, hoping that maybe their body would hold out just a little longer. As you stand in that imagined hallway again, velvet robe brushing the stone floor, your breath catching in your throat as the herald calls your name, you feel it, the weight of expectation, centuries old. Not love, not joy, but obligation, duty wrapped in gold thread. And somewhere deep inside a voice that wonders, what if I had been born in a time when blood wasn't everything? But for now, you lower your eyes, curtsy once more, and step forward into history. The first name you hear tonight, at least, the first that history refused to forget, is Joanna of Castile. You may have heard her called Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, a nickname whispered through centuries like the creak of an old wooden door. But madness, like beauty, is a matter of perspective. And in Joanna's case, that perspective was shaped not just by politics, but by blood, specifically the kind of blood that had already been passed back and forth through royal veins for generations. You meet her first as a young woman in velvet, with auburn hair pulled tightly beneath a jeweled net. She stands at the center of a cathedral, her hands trembling slightly as she prepares to wed Philip, the handsome son of the Holy Roman Emperor. A match made in heaven, they said. But heaven, as always, had a loophole. Philip was her cousin, not in the distant family reunion sort of way, but close enough that today's genetics textbooks would start raising red flags and drawing little diagrams in bold red ink. Still, the match thrilled the courts. Philip was charismatic, ambitious and famously attractive with a jawline that painters adored and mistresses couldn't resist. Joanna, on the other hand, was brilliant and emotional, deeply educated, devout, and not prepared for the kind of betrayal that would soon unravel her entirely. Theirs was not a fairy tale. It was the slow descent of a woman deeply in love with a man who saw her as a stepping stone. At first she adored him, obsessively. That part is undisputed. But when Philip began cheating, openly flaunting his infidelity in court, something in Joanna cracked. Witnesses described fits of jealousy so intense that she would scream, throw objects, and once even attacked a lady-in-waiting with a pair of embroidery scissors. Her emotional volatility, compounded by a total lack of agency, quickly became court gossip, and then court diagnosis. But was she truly mad? Historians still argue whether Joanna suffered from an actual mental illness, or whether her behavior was the entirely rational response of a politically trapped woman, isolated in foreign lands surrounded by men who stood to benefit from her disempowerment. Her father, Ferdinand, used her instability to seize control of Castile. Her husband used it to limit her influence. Her son, Charles V, later used it to justify keeping her under confinement for nearly 50 years. That's not madness, that's politics. Still, what's rarely discussed is the genetic soup bubbling beneath the surface. Joanna and Philip's union wasn't unique. They were both products of generations of intermarriage between Spanish and Austrian nobility. Their shared ancestry wasn't just ink on a family tree. It was a roadmap of hereditary vulnerabilities, and their children would carry the consequences. Take Charles V, their most famous son and ruler of a vast empire stretching across Europe and the Americas. He was brilliant, strategic, and remarkably functional, given what he inherited. But he also suffered from debilitating gout-frequent depression and a severely protruding jaw, what would later become the trademark of the Habsburg dynasty. His body bore the stamp of his lineage, his mouth unable to close fully his jaw, misaligned, making speech difficult and chewing laborious. This jawline, medically known as mandibular prognathism, would be passed down and amplified in his descendants until it became a symbol of royal inbreeding. But long before it became a meme in modern textbooks, it was already complicating lives, from infant feeding to social presence. And it began in earnest with Charles V, the truly strange detail. Despite everything, despite Joanna's mental decline, despite Charles's worsening health, this line of blood was considered elite. Marrying within it wasn't just accepted, it was seen as keeping the stock pure. Like some grotesque parody of pedigree breeding noble families, boasted of shared ancestry, as though it were a guarantee of loyalty and strength, rather than a harbinger of inherited weakness. And so the cycle continued. Another tidbit tucked between official records after Philip's sudden death. Joanna was so consumed by grief that she reportedly traveled with his embalmed body, refusing to bury him for months. Some accounts, likely colored by political bias, describe her kissing the corpse sleeping beside it, or insisting that no woman be allowed near the coffin. Was this madness grief? A woman cracking under pressure? Or simply the most human reaction in a world where she was stripped of all other choices? What's certain is this: Joanna never ruled in her own right. Despite being Queen of Castile by law, she spent the majority of her life locked away in the convent of Tordesillas, watched over by guards, visited rarely by her children. She would outlive her husband by decades, outlast many of her jailers, and remain a prisoner of blood, hers and his, and her daughters, the ones who inherited not just her title but her genes. Some would suffer similar fates: quiet illnesses, sudden deaths, lingering sadness misdiagnosed as weakness. One in particular would marry into yet another cousin-heavy royal house, producing children who couldn't speak until age 6 and who suffered seizures before adolescence. This is where things begin to feel less like history and more like inheritance. You start to sense it, how one generation's ambition becomes the next's burden, how one marriage deemed advantageous in a council chamber echoes forward in fevers, deformities and isolation, not in wars or coronations, but in broken teeth and soft sobs behind closed curtains. And yet through it all, these royal women are painted in formal portraits, as serene and composed. Their biographies list them as dutiful consorts or pious daughters. Their symptoms softened into vague phrases like delicate constitution or fragile temperament. Rarely do the records say plainly this child suffered from the consequences of genetic compression, from a body forced into replication rather than renewal. Still, their presence lingers. In archives, you'll find strange medical reports written in Latin, cataloging tremors in the limbs, abnormal cranial structure, or simply born silent. In one case, a royal midwife recorded that a newborn's tongue was fused to the bottom of the mouth, a condition likely tied to inbreeding, though no one dared say so aloud. The child lived just 3 days, and in a quieter corner of a European library there remains a small prayer book, worn with soft leather edges, believed to have belonged to one of Joanna's daughters. In the margins, in cramped and careful handwriting, someone had written, "I was not born of sin, but of design. Let that not be mine to pass on." It's a sentence that catches in your throat. You wonder how many royal daughters whispered similar thoughts to themselves in the dark. How many prayed not for glory, but for release? How many stood beneath chandeliers in dresses heavy with brocade, dreaming only of a life where their children would be born, without the weight of 1,000 years on their ribs? And you wonder quietly how many of them ever got what they wished for. You find yourself now in the echoing halls of a different palace, cool, high-ceilinged, smelling faintly of incense and beeswax. The woman at the center of this next chapter is not forgotten by history, but she is often flattened by it, reduced to a footnote beside the man she married and the empire she helped steady. Her name was Isabella of Portugal, and if Joanna of Castile was remembered for her grief and fire, then Isabella was remembered for the quiet collapse of a body that tried too hard for too long. Isabella married Charles V, son of Joanna, and Philip, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain. He was her cousin, of course. That's how these stories go. But their marriage was said to be one of the rare instances where affection bloomed slowly and awkwardly between two royals, tied together by blood. Charles, who had grown up in the cold bureaucratic courts of the Low Countries, found something soothing in Isabella's dignity and intelligence. She, in turn, was drawn to his ambition and need for structure, perhaps, because she too understood what it meant to live according to inherited expectations. But affection, even genuine affection, could not mend what years of shared ancestry had already written into their bones. Their union was politically expedient, but genetically perilous. Both Isabella and Charles descended from multiple generations of intermarried royal lines, particularly the Trastamaras and the Habsburgs. So their children were born from a pool of blood that had been stirred for centuries, without new ingredients. And it showed. Out of their 7 children, only 3 survived into adulthood. One son was deaf. One daughter suffered from chronic illness. And their most famous son, Philip II of Spain, would go on to marry his own niece, continuing the spiral. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Isabella herself was a model consort, graceful, multilingual, and well-versed in diplomacy. She often acted as regent when Charles was away managing affairs with quiet competence. Her letters reveal a woman who was thoughtful, articulate, and occasionally overwhelmed by the scale of her responsibilities, but never irresponsible. Unlike some queens who left no paper trail beyond what others wrote about them, Isabella's voice survives in her own words, and it tells us she cared deeply for her role for her people and for her children, and still her body betrayed her. Isabella suffered frequent illnesses that modern historians now believe may have been linked to a hereditary blood disorder, possibly a mild form of hemophilia, or a related clotting issue. It wasn't enough to kill her outright, but enough to weaken her to turn childbirth into a repeated risk, and to leave her vulnerable to infections that her immune system simply couldn't fend off. She died young, just 35 years old, after what was officially recorded as a sudden illness. But sudden in 16th century terminology often meant we don't understand this well enough to name it. It could have been a stroke. It could have been sepsis. Or it could have been the quiet breaking of a body already stretched too far. What's especially haunting is that Isabella's decline wasn't dramatic. There were no screaming fits, no collapsed staircases, no dramatic court whispers, just a steady unraveling. One day she was walking the gardens. A week later she was in bed. A few days after that the palace was in mourning. Still Isabella's legacy endured. Her children, flawed though they were, carried forward the bloodline, along with its burdens. And through them her story became less about who she was and more about what she passed on. Here's a curious tidbit Isabella was fluent in at least 5 languages: Castilian Portuguese, French Latin, and a bit of Flemish, and had a personal interest in alchemy, particularly the medicinal uses of herbs and metals. She reportedly kept a handwritten recipe book that included everything from rosewater tonics to mercury-laced treatments for menstrual cramps. It was this intellectual curiosity, ironically, that made her seem slightly odd at court. In a world where most queens were expected to smile, embroider, and bear sons, Isabella stood out simply for wanting to understand things. And yet understanding couldn't save her. One of her ladies-in-waiting once wrote, she seemed to know what waited for her. Not the end, perhaps, but the thinning of her strength. That quiet phrase, the thinning of her strength, reads like a metaphor, but it may also be literal. Hemophilia and other clotting disorders don't just affect bleeding. They affect how the body heals, how energy is sustained, how infections are fought. To live with such a condition, especially in an era before microscopes or antiseptics, was to live on the edge of exhaustion. Historians still debate whether Isabella's illnesses were the direct result of inbreeding or simply the product of poor medical care and overwork. After all, royal women were expected to do everything and do it silently. But the genetic math is difficult to ignore. With so many overlapping ancestors, it's not just possible, but probable, that the mutations responsible for clotting disorders were being recycled again and again through the family line. In fact, modern geneticists who've studied the Habsburg dynasty have traced dozens of conditions, some mild, some severe, back to a handful of repeated genetic combinations. And while men in the family often displayed physical traits like the famous Habsburg jaw, it was the women who bore the hidden costs in stillbirths, in hemorrhaging labors, in long recoveries that left them too tired to hold their own children. Isabella, with all her refinement and resilience, was one of the first royal daughters to truly embody this quiet tragedy. She wasn't cast aside like Joanna. She wasn't locked away. She did everything right. And still she suffered. It's easy to look at portraits of these women, perfectly posed, framed in gilt, and forget that they were human, that their eyes might have itched, their knees ached in the cold, their stomachs turned sour after meals, that they woke at night worried not just about politics, but about whether the baby they carried would live, or if it would be like the last one, small blue, and gone by morning. And yet even in the face of that fear they kept going, not because they had a choice, but because stopping wasn't part of the job description. A queen who mourned too loudly could be accused of hysteria. A queen who refused to try again could be replaced. There were always more daughters, always more cousins, always another alliance waiting to be secured. It's in that quiet, relentless pressure that Isabella's story finds its shape. She wasn't loud. She didn't rage. She carried the weight of her lineage the way a dancer might carry a too heavy crown with grace, and with no small amount of pain. And when she finally lay still, gone before her time, her children still young, The empire mourned her with the same decorum it had demanded of her in life. Black banners, tolling bells, and a solemn requiem. But no one could rewind what had already been set in motion. Her son Philip II would carry the torch next, and as you'll soon see, he carried it straight into yet another cousin's waiting arms. By now you've met the mother and the grandmother. You've seen the grief, the confusion, and the strange calm that follows generations of obligation disguised as honor. And now you begin to notice something peculiar, not just in their stories, but in their faces. At first it's subtle. The portraits lining castle halls blur together similar cheekbones, similar brows. But then it becomes unmistakable, that jaw, long, heavy, pronounced. So defined it looks sculpted by stone rather than inherited from flesh. This, of course, is the infamous Habsburg jaw, also known as mandibular prognathism, a condition where the lower jaw juts out significantly past the upper. And for the Habsburg dynasty, it became more than just a family trait. It became a warning. But in the 1500s, no one was warning anyone. Instead, this jawline, paired with a long, aquiline nose, drooping eyelids, and wide-set eyes, was quietly recorded in art and brushed over in commentary. Royal portraits softened its severity. Descriptions danced around it. The jaw was described as distinguished, firm, handsome, even when it caused lisping, speech difficulty, chewing, and chronic jaw pain. No one dared to say the obvious. It was the visible marker of too many cousins marrying too many cousins. What's quietly astonishing is how visible the link between inbreeding and facial traits has become to modern geneticists. A 2019 study published in the Annals of Human Biology used facial measurements from official Habsburg portraits to confirm a direct correlation between the degree of jaw protrusion and the calculated inbreeding coefficient of each royal. In other words, the more inbred you were, the more your jaw stuck out. It wasn't symbolism. It was science. But to the people living then, the consequences weren't purely cosmetic. Take Charles II of Spain, great-grandson of both Joanna and Isabella. His jaw was so misaligned, he couldn't chew solid food properly, and reportedly had trouble speaking clearly, even as an adult. He drooled excessively, suffered constant gastrointestinal issues, and struggled with seizures and mental lapses. His court records are riddled with euphemisms of delicate temperament, prone to fatigue, slow of understanding. The reality was harsher. He was a severely disabled man trapped in the center of an empire, the product of generations of genetic recycling. Still, Charles II wouldn't be born for another century. In the 1500s, the traits were only beginning to take shape. They manifested first in daughters, and they weren't always physical. Slight facial asymmetries, speech delays, recurrent infections, and emotional volatility. These signs were noted but rarely connected to inheritance. Instead, they were written off as personality quirks, or more often moral failings. A girl with slurred speech wasn't inbred. She was rebellious. A daughter who refused food wasn't sick. She was melancholic. The language around them blurred cause and effect, masking the deeper roots. It's worth pausing here to ask, why didn't they stop? Why didn't royal families look at the increasing deformities, the infant mortality, the long string of daughters who died before 25, and say enough? Historians still argue whether they truly understood the risks. Some suggest that within the royal houses, the evidence was clear but ignored. Others believe that the concept of genetic health was so foreign that symptoms were attributed to sin, divine punishment, or maternal failure. And then there's the darker possibility that they did know, at least intuitively, but chose lineage over longevity. After all, if you marry a cousin, you control the narrative. You control the children. And if those children suffer, you can always try again. There's a chilling tidbit from court records in Vienna. One physician in the late 1500s reported privately that a royal infant had been born with a mouth too narrow for God's breath. He was dismissed for blasphemy, not because the description was inaccurate, but because it was said aloud. And what about the girls? The royal daughters whose jaws didn't yet protrude, but whose destinies were already shaped by those who came before them. Many were sent into marriages young, some before puberty with partners who looked more like uncles than husbands. In one documented case, a 13-year-old archduchess was married to her mother's brother, making him both her husband and her uncle. The wedding contract lists the match as optimal because of shared heritage. It also includes a clause detailing how the girl should be introduced to conjugal duties, gradually to protect her from emotional distress. In other words, they knew but did it anyway. In private letters, some of these daughters tried to express their confusion. One girl whose name is lost, but whose letters survived, wrote to her nursemaid, "My husband has my grandfather's hands. I find it difficult to look at him." Another, who would later die in childbirth at age 16, kept a diary in which she sketched the family tree not as branches, but as circles feeding into each other. She labeled it the Crown's Garden, though it read more like a maze. Even the courts began to feel the strain. When portraits were commissioned, artists were increasingly instructed to idealize features. This wasn't just vanity, it was a defense mechanism. If the world saw nothing strange, perhaps nothing was wrong. But not everyone was fooled. Visiting ambassadors began commenting quietly on the resemblance between spouses, the odd lilt in a princess's voice, the identical stoop shared by siblings from separate marriages. The whispers grew louder, even as the weddings continued. And yet, despite everything, despite the pain, the secrecy, the growing medical mystery, these daughters rarely complained publicly. They wore their gowns, learned their Latin, memorized their family trees. They smiled in portraits and bled in silence. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Habsburg jaw isn't its shape or severity. It's the way it tells a story without words. A story of lineage over love, of repetition over renewal, of how something as small as a bone structure could reflect a dynasty's entire philosophy: keep everything in the family no matter the cost. And the cost was only beginning to show. As you leave this section behind, imagine a mirror, not one of silver or gold, but glass, clear and sharp. Picture a royal daughter standing before it. She turns her head slightly, noticing how her profile matches that of her cousin, her mother, her grandfather. She touches her jawline. She doesn't say anything. She just knows. And then she lowers her hand, steps away, and prepares for her wedding. The hall is lit with candles, hundreds of them. Their flames shimmer along the gold trim of a too-heavy wedding gown, the air thick with frankincense and expectation. Somewhere behind the curtain of noble onlookers, a girl takes a slow, deliberate breath. She's 17. Her name is Anna of Austria, and she is about to marry her uncle. The year is 1570. Anna is a Habsburg princess daughter of Emperor Maximilian II and niece to King Philip II of Spain. Her blood is not just royal, it's hyper-royal, a concentrated brew of Spanish and Austrian Habsburg lineage, where nearly every branch of her family tree loops back on itself. And her husband-to-be Philip is 43. He is her father's brother, and as such her closest male relative. But none of that matters today. What matters is that the match has been approved by the Pope, celebrated by the court, and preserved in elegant ink across a binding dynastic agreement. It was, from a political standpoint, impeccable. Philip II was a widower 3 times over. His first wife, Maria Manuela, had also been his cousin. His second, Mary Thorne of England, had died childless. His third wife, Anna's own cousin, had given him a son, Don Carlos, whose erratic behavior and eventual death were whispered about in every chamber of Europe. And now, as a final consolidation of both bloodline and succession, Philip turned to Anna, the most fertile-looking daughter of his own brother. If it sounds disturbing, that's because it is. But in the language of empire, Anna's role was not wife-niece or even woman. She was a solution. The wedding took place in Segovia amid days of public celebration. Spanish poets praised Anna's modesty, her youth, her tranquil nature. Philip, known for his severity and religious devotion, offered no public comment. But behind the scenes, the union was something of a gamble. He was aging prone to illness, and already suffering from what modern scholars suspect was a form of chronic gout. Anna, meanwhile, was known to be robust, healthy cheeks, a steady walk, and importantly, no family history of stillbirths. Or so they hoped. But genes don't care about optimism. Anna and Philip had 5 children together. 3 survived infancy. 1 would become Philip III of Spain, a monarch plagued by indecision, and described by one ambassador as physically present, but often elsewhere in thought. He too would continue the cycle of cousin marriage, marrying his own niece, and producing children who showed signs of neurological and muscular disorders by age 6. The pattern was repeating itself, and Anna was in the center of it, giving birth again and again, enduring each labor with stoic grace, all while living in a palace that had already buried 3 queens before her. By her 5th pregnancy, Anna began to suffer from what the court physicians called internal weakness. She had recurring fevers, trouble walking, and what we might now recognize as postpartum depletion, possibly even a form of undiagnosed eclampsia. But like so many royal women, her discomfort was treated as seasonal, even aesthetic. She was simply weary, said the records. She required more prayer. Here's a curious tidbit. Anna was deeply devout, and it's said she insisted on praying aloud during labor. One courtier recorded that during one birth, she recited all 15 mysteries of the rosary between contractions. Whether this was an act of spiritual comfort or distraction from pain, we can't know. But it adds a deeply human texture to her story. A 17-year-old girl growing into a mother and monarch, trying to find a way to endure a world that rarely asked how she felt. Still, she managed to navigate her marriage with surprising calm. Unlike Philip's previous wives, Anna seemed to soften him. Their letters, though formal, reveal warmth. He praised her equanimity, her care for the children, her presence at court. In return, she addressed him with respect and a hint of tenderness. If their bond wasn't romantic, it was at least functional and improvement by royal standards. But love, as we've seen, was never the point. Anna died in 1580 at just 30 years old, most likely from complications following childbirth. The records again say sudden illness, the same vague phrase that accompanied so many early deaths among royal women. Philip, reportedly devastated, withdrew from court life for weeks. He kept a miniature portrait of Anna by his bedside until his own death. And yet their marriage, for all its moments of affection, remains one of the most genetically hazardous unions in the Habsburg dynasty. Historians still debate whether this marriage marked a tipping point in the family's genetic decline. Some suggest that Philip and Anna's children showed the earliest signs of the neurological disorders that would later plague the Spanish branch. Others argue the damage had already been done by prior generations, and Anna was simply one more link in an already fragile chain. What's not up for debate is this: by marrying his niece Philip II, not only intensified the family's genetic entanglement, but also normalized a practice that would persist long after it should have stopped. It became expected, even admired. Paintings of Anna from this period show her with serene features, hands clasped, gaze softened. The perfect queen, the perfect niece. But behind the portraits was a woman whose body bore the weight of Empire 5 pregnancies, 2 funerals, countless nights spent in quiet exhaustion. And like Isabella before her, Anna left no diary, no sharp letters, no defiant quotes. Only glimpses in others' words, a Spanish chronicler who called her the gentle hinge between 2 kings, a midwife who noted she prayed even when bleeding, and a single surviving dress altered posthumously to fit her sister. Even now it's hard to say where Anna the person ends and Anna the concept begins. She is both the girl in the veil and the name on the scroll, the daughter sacrificed for dynastic neatness, the niece who became a queen, the woman who was told gently but firmly that she had been born to do this and did. You wonder if she had lived longer into her 40s. Perhaps what she might have thought of the son she left behind. Whether she would have noticed the subtle tics in his posture, the vacant moments in his stare. Whether she would have traced those traits back to herself, to Philip, to Joanna, to Isabella. Whether she would have whispered one evening to her reflection in the mirror, "I think we've gone too far." But we'll never know, because Anna, like so many royal daughters before her, vanished before the questions could be asked. And the dynasty marched on down the same narrowing corridor, lit by candles lined with portraits, and echoing with the quiet sound of blood meeting blood. So the portraits continue, one face blending gently into the next. Wide foreheads, tightly laced bodices, the same distant expressions, painted by different hands. From Joanna to Isabella to Anna, each woman appears more composed than the last, as if time were not passing but circling, as if the Habsburg daughters were being pressed from the same mold generation after generation. The gowns change, the candlelight shifts, but the story stays the same. Now you find yourself in a quieter court. France. The air is lighter here, more perfumed. The tapestries are paler, the ceilings higher. But don't be fooled. The bloodlines are just as tangled, the expectations just as tight. And at the center of it all is a woman who seems at first glance to have done everything right. Her name is Maria Teresa of Spain, and though her name might not immediately stand out, her story is quietly devastating. Maria Teresa was born in 1638, the daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and Elizabeth of France. Her parents were first cousins. Their parents had also been cousins. So by the time Maria Teresa came into the world, she was already the product of 3 generations of deliberate inbreeding. Her genetic makeup wasn't just fragile, it was exhausted. And yet on the surface, she seemed perfectly suited for the life of a queen. She was educated, obedient, fluent in both Spanish and French. She played the harpsichord embroidered like a professional, and was praised for her gentleness. These were all, of course, rehearsals for the role she was always meant to play, Queen of France. Her marriage to Louis XIV, the Sun King, was a political masterstroke. It was meant to end a long and bitter conflict between France and Spain, a treaty sealed with a wedding. The bride was 22, the groom her double cousin. Yes, double they were related through both their mothers and fathers. The genetic circle was now spinning so tightly it had become a spiral. At court, Maria Teresa was treated with courtesy, but never warmth. Louis, famously extravagant and eternally restless, quickly took mistresses, many and publicly. Maria Teresa, by contrast, was deeply religious and painfully shy. She never truly integrated into the French court, and her heavy Spanish accent made her the subject of subtle mockery. Some whispered that she was slow, others that she was unwell. In truth, she was probably both a woman, shaped by her genes, and her role caught in a glittering prison with nowhere to turn. Still, she bore 6 children. Only one survived to adulthood. The others, 2 sons, 3 daughters, died of fever seizures, or in their sleep, often before their first birthday. Each time, Maria Teresa grieved quietly. The court observed official mourning. Then the cycle began again. Historians still argue whether Maria Teresa suffered from a specific genetic disorder. Some suggest mitochondrial disease. Others believe she may have had a mild neurological condition that affected her coordination and stamina. Contemporary records describe her as tired, easily slow to recover from illness, and prone to migraines so intense she couldn't open her eyes. But none of these were given a name. Instead, they were written off as evidence of her Spanish delicacy. And yet she endured. She performed her duties. She attended Mass daily. She walked the marble halls beside her husband's endless parade of favorites, never once raising her voice or protesting in public. Her letters to her father are formal and sparse. Her diary, what survives of it, is full of references to saints' seasonal feasts and the health of her children, never herself. There's a tidbit from the royal wardrobe records. Maria Teresa kept 14 mourning dresses in active rotation, each in varying shades of black. Not because she was theatrical, but because she was always in mourning for someone, a child, a sibling, a niece, a cousin. It was said she once whispered to her confessor, "There is no room left in my heart to sow joy into." She died in 1683 from what official reports called an abscess of the arm, though modern interpretations suggest it was likely sepsis from an untreated infection possibly brought on by chronic anemia or immune system compromise. She was 44 years old. Louis Ever the Showman remarked at her funeral, "This is the first time she has caused me pain," a line that history has not forgotten. But the true legacy of Maria Teresa wasn't just her sadness. It was her son, the only one to survive Louis the Grand Dauphin, who would continue the cycle. He too married a cousin. His children also suffered from fragile health. The line staggered forward each generation, carrying just enough strength to reproduce, but never to thrive. You begin to feel the weight of it now. Not the drama, not the grandeur, but the repetition. How each royal daughter is not just a person, but a symptom of the system. How each death becomes part of the plan, each loss absorbed and replaced with another match, another cousin, another fragile child. And all of it wrapped in silks and prayers and the polite lie that this was how the world was meant to be. Maria Teresa was not a rebel. She didn't fight the system. She didn't even question it, at least not in writing. But she remains important because her life shows just how deep the normalization of inbreeding had gone. It wasn't a scandal. It was standard. The church allowed it. The courts celebrated it. And the daughters endured it. It's strange to realize that someone so surrounded by opulence could live such a threadbare life. But that was the reality of many royal women, especially those like Maria Teresa, who were born of compromise and married into performance. They were taught to be symbols, not people. And symbols don't get to break. Even centuries later, her story lingers not in grand statues or sweeping memoirs, but in the footnotes of family trees in the medical charts of her descendants, and in the careful way her face is painted soft, symmetrical, and just a little too still. As you walk away from this part of the story, the palace fades behind you. Another hallway, another candlelit corridor, and ahead more daughters, more marriages. The same loop spun once more around the axis of blood. You step into the hush of an ornate antechamber, part cathedral, part strategy room. Incense burns, quills scratch, and somewhere behind closed doors, a cardinal and a secretary are reviewing yet another marriage petition, bound in crimson ribbon and dusted with rosewater. This isn't a romantic letter. It's a request for papal permission for a cousin to marry his cousin's daughter, or his niece, or both, depending on how urgently the throne requires it. Welcome to the Vatican's lesser-known specialty, the dispensation business. In the Catholic world of the 1500s and beyond, marrying close kin was technically forbidden, a sin known as consanguinity. Canon law outlawed unions between people up to the 4th degree of relation, meaning even second cousins were sometimes off limits. But there was a loophole, a big one. If your family was noble, wealthy, and influential enough, you could ask the Pope for an exemption. And the Church, ever pragmatic, often said yes, because as it turns out, morality was flexible, especially when thrones were at stake. This is how kings married nieces, uncles, married their sisters' daughters, and cousins married cousins 3 times over, without technically committing a sin. All it took was a little paperwork. The dispensations were formal, elaborate, and carefully phrased to sound like spiritual guidance for the unity of the Christian people and the stability of kingdoms. His Holiness grants this union. Never mind the recessive genes. And what of the daughters caught in this clerical web? They had no say in it. The decision was usually made before their first bloodletting, signed between fathers and uncles, overseen by cardinals who wore silk gloves and smelled faintly of frankincense in politics. But don't worry, they said these matches would be safe. The risks were manageable. After all, weren't the parents healthy? Hadn't their own parents done the same? Of course, medical understanding at the time was generous at best. In royal courts, the closest thing to genetic counseling was a cautious glance at the family portraits. If too many children had been painted with sunken eyes or crooked jaws, the advisors might quietly suggest marrying a little further afield. But more often the solution was to pray harder or drink more goat milk. A mainstream historical fact worth remembering here: by the mid-1500s, the Church had issued hundreds of dispensations for cousin marriages across European courts, with Spain, Portugal, and certain Italian principalities leading the list. The practice became so routine that entire bureaucracies within the Vatican existed just to process noble marriage exemptions. It was a spiritual rubber stamp on what was essentially a genetic time bomb. Meanwhile, medicine in this era was a peculiar blend of astrology, bloodletting, and herbs, with names like Mother's Sorrow and Red Gall. Female complaints, everything from seizures to infertility, were usually attributed to imbalanced humors or a wandering womb, a concept where the uterus was believed to roam freely through the body, causing hysteria. The cure: cold compresses, or sometimes leeches, occasionally just marriage itself. And if a daughter collapsed from exhaustion or lost her fourth child in a row, she was encouraged to go on pilgrimage. Not to a spa, mind you, but to a saint's bones in another city, with the hope that divine intervention might succeed where the herbs had failed. Here's a tidbit: one queen reportedly soaked her undergarments in wine, infused with powdered unicorn horn, believing it would strengthen her womb. It didn't. But the papal doctor made a small fortune-sourcing horn from narwhal tusks, imported from the Arctic, and nobody dared question him, because questioning medicine meant questioning God's plan. And God, according to every bishop in the room, wanted the bloodline pure. Historians still argue whether the Vatican was truly unaware of the long-term consequences of these unions, or simply chose to look away. Some point to 16th century papal correspondence that expressed concerns about the visible maladies of His Catholic Majesty's children. Others believed the Church viewed these families as divinely appointed, above the natural laws that governed ordinary bodies. After all, kings were God's chosen. Their illnesses were trials. Their daughters' deaths were unfortunate, but not unholy. And if the next bride in line also happened to be a cousin, well, the Lord works in mysterious ways. It's a delicate kind of cruelty, one hidden in folds of velvet and Latin phrases. The girls were blessed, anointed, and declared sacred property of dynasties that saw them as vessels. First people second. Their bodies were mapped before they understood how limbs worked. Their names were chosen not for meaning, but for memorability in treaties. Maria, Isabella, Anna, Teresa, like beads on a rosary, smooth and interchangeable. Still, some tried to push back. Quietly. One duchess from southern Italy, upon learning that her daughter was betrothed to her cousin, reportedly tried to delay the marriage by faking the girl's illness. She claimed the child was plagued by vapors. It worked for 6 months. Then the Pope signed the dispensation, and the wedding proceeded as planned, with a blessing from the same cardinal, who had recommended more nettle tea for the child's headaches. You wonder what the girls themselves thought on the morning of such weddings, if they felt lucky, or doomed, or nothing at all. Perhaps some of them believed what they were told, that they were honored, necessary, beloved. Perhaps they looked at their own mothers, saw the same faces, and thought, this is what it means to be good, to be obedient, to be chosen. Or maybe in the privacy of their bedchambers, they whispered the questions no priest could answer. Why me? Why him? Why this again? We don't have their journals, but we have the results. By the 1600s, an entire generation of European noble families had intermarried so frequently that their genealogical charts began to resemble twisted ropes instead of trees. Children born with clubbed feet, fused spines, or developmental delays were labeled as delicate or blessedly simple. The records never call them what they were, victims of strategy. And yet the system kept spinning, because the church blessed it, because medicine excused it, because kings needed heirs and daughters needed roles. And so the candles kept burning, and the bells kept ringing, and the carriages kept arriving, each bearing a girl in white, stepping quietly into a future drawn up, not in dreams, but in dispensations and dread. You keep walking quiet footsteps now echoing through a hall that grows grander and grimmer by the moment. The painted ceilings soar, the chandeliers drip crystal, and the portraits on the walls begin to all look eerily familiar. Not just because they're all royal, not just because they're all regal, but because the faces seem to repeat. Same jaw, same nose, same sloping forehead. The longer you look, the more you realize this wasn't just a family. It was a loop. And no royal family in the 1500s spun that genetic loop tighter than the Habsburgs. By the time you reach Charles II of Spain, the end product of centuries of dynastic marriages, the House of Habsburg has effectively married itself into collapse. And yet, astonishingly, the empire built on these fragile foundations sprawled across Europe, parts of the Americas, and even dipped into Asia and Africa. How did a dynasty that had so many heirs unfit to rule manage to hold power for so long? The answer is simple strategy appearances, and the utter refusal to admit that anything was wrong. Charles II was born in 1661, but the legacy that shaped him began far earlier, rooted in the ambitions of his forebears. His great-grandfather, Philip I, married his double cousin, Joanna of Castile. Their children married more cousins. Their children's children married even closer relatives. By the time Charles arrived, he was the result of generations of what scientists now call pedigree collapse, when your family tree folds in on itself like a badly stacked game of dominoes. The result, Charles had one of the highest known coefficients of inbreeding of any monarch in history, roughly equivalent to the offspring of a brother-sister union. And you could see it. The infamous Habsburg jaw. His was so pronounced he couldn't chew properly. He didn't learn to speak until age 4, couldn't walk unaided until age 8. And throughout his life he was plagued with seizures, intestinal disorders, infections, and what contemporary doctors vaguely called melancholia. One ambassador wrote that he was ugly of face and body, and lacked the strength to father an heir, which unfortunately for the dynasty turned out to be true. But let's step back for a moment. It's easy to look at Charles as a tragic punchline, but he was a person. A boy born into palaces of cold stone and colder expectations. A child who didn't ask to be a royal experiment in keeping bloodlines pure. His caretakers rotated frequently, few dared discipline him, and he spent most of his life surrounded by sycophants who feared the wrath of the Spanish court more than the decline of the royal body. He grew up believing he was divinely chosen, even as his own reflection betrayed him. Can you imagine that loneliness? Now here's a quirky tidbit. Charles was so physically and mentally frail that court astrologers were consulted at every key decision in his life. Not doctors, not advisors, astrologers. One even insisted that Charles's wedding should take place on a specific lunar alignment to ensure virility. Spoiler alert, it didn't help. Historians still argue whether Charles's symptoms stemmed entirely from inbreeding, or whether early childhood malnutrition and court negligence also played a role. Some have suggested mitochondrial disorders. Others point to the toxic medical treatments he received, including mercury and lead-based remedies as possible contributors. But what remains indisputable is this: his genetic background gave him little chance from the start. And yet the empire churned on. Gold still flowed from the Americas. Wars were still waged. Treaties were still signed. From the outside, Spain remained a superpower. Inside, the royal family was buckling. The advisors around Charles clung to rituals and pageantry, parading him in robes and jewels. To hide what was obvious, he was dying slowly, and the line was breaking. When Charles died in 1700, childless, and racked by years of illness, it didn't just mark the end of a life, it marked the end of a line. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, one of the largest and most devastating conflicts in early modern Europe. And all because for generations no one was willing to bring in fresh blood. In his will, Charles named as his successor Philip of Anjou, grandson of Francis Louis XIV, another royal house with its own entangled bloodlines, though not quite as dire. The move horrified other European powers who feared that France and Spain under one monarch would shift the balance of power. And so they fought. 12 years of bloodshed, hundreds of thousands of lives, all sparked in part by a man who never stood a chance. The court physicians performed an autopsy on Charles's body. According to contemporary accounts, they reported that his heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were decayed, his intestines were rotted, and he had a single testicle black as coal. Whether or not these claims are medically accurate, or the result of Baroque embellishment, they tell a truth about perception even in death. Charles became a symbol, a warning, a closing chapter to a century that believed royal blood was more valuable than human health. And you keep walking, past the empty nursery, past the chapel where his body lay in state, past the portraits of him painted far handsomer than he ever was. The air is still. The candlelight flickers. And now in the distance you begin to hear new voices, softer, foreign, unexpected. Because this isn't just a European story. The silence is about to shift. You've lingered long enough in the cold stone chambers of European palaces, where royal daughters were matched with men who shared more than titles, they shared their blood. But as you quietly turn a corner in this sleepy corridor of history, the air changes. It grows warmer, thick with the scent of rosewater and sandalwood. Now we step barefoot and unhurried into a different kind of palace, one carved not from Gothic arches, but red sandstone and white marble. You are in the Mughal Empire, deep within the heart of 16th century India. Here the world looks different, but the story feels hauntingly familiar. Ruqayya Sultan Begum was just 9 years old when she was married to her cousin Prince Akbar. 9, an age when most children are still chasing butterflies or reciting verses from memory. But for a girl born into the line of Timur and Babur, childhood was not a destination. It was a corridor that ended early with the opening of marriage gates. Akbar, of course, would grow to be one of the most celebrated rulers of India, known for his military genius and liberal court policies. But before the war elephants and throne rooms, there was this early marriage arranged to unite bloodlines and secure legitimacy. The marriage was not particularly unusual for its time. In fact, cousin marriage within royal lines was a well-established tradition, seen as a way to keep the imperial circle pure and unbroken. Yet while Akbar would go on to take hundreds of wives' alliances crafted across religion and region, Ruqayya remained the chief consort, the woman closest to his childhood, and perhaps his heart. But closeness has its own price. Ruqayya never bore children. It's a detail so quietly repeated in court annals that it almost vanishes into the silk of her status. She held the title Padshah Begum, the Queen of Queens, but her chambers, for all their grandeur, were silent of lullabies. In a world where women were remembered for the sons they gave empires, her legacy curled like incense, soft, ephemeral, and easily dismissed. Still, power takes many shapes. Ruqayya may have lacked heirs, but she had presence. When Akbar's grandson, the young Prince Khurram, who would later become the Emperor Shah Jahan, was born, Ruqayya insisted on raising him herself. And so the future builder of the Taj Mahal spent his formative years in her care, cradled not by his mother, but by the arms of a woman who knew too well the weight of expectation. Perhaps it was her way of leaving something behind, not through blood, but through love. She wasn't merely a ceremonial figure. Historical records describe Ruqayya as intelligent and politically aware, often advising Akbar in private, even when others at court feared to speak freely. She was his confidant, his childhood companion turned empress, the one he trusted when the empire's burden grew heavy. And though her public influence waned over time, her private dignity never faltered. She remained in the imperial fold until her death, outliving Akbar by over 20 years. Yet you can't help but imagine the ache behind the silks, the gardens she walked, the mirrored halls she passed through each morning, the small hopes she may have dared to hold before they faded into routine. There's an old court record that speaks of her fondness for rare perfumes, not just casual scents, but obsessive, ritualistic dousing. She had her own perfumer, a man whose only job was to refresh her aroma every hour on the hour. Rosewater for morning myrrh, for afternoon ambergris at dusk. Maybe it was vanity. Maybe it was a kind of armor fragrance as a veil separating her from the disappointments she was expected never to voice. In the Mughal world, cousin marriages were accepted, but rarely repeated to the extent seen in European houses like the Habsburgs. The dynasty valued heritage, yes, but didn't usually compress the gene pool over multiple generations. Still, the consequences of such unions did arise from time to time. Court physicians whispered of fragile infants and sudden deaths of daughters who grew weak in the womb or sons who never took a second breath. These stories didn't make it into the grand court histories. They lived in the margins, in the worried glances of midwives, and the fevered prayers of mothers who knew that a noble birth did not guarantee survival. Ruqayya's story is both an exception and a mirror. She stood at the top of an empire that blended Persian grandeur with Indian vibrancy. Her walls were inlaid with lapis and gold, her nights lit by oil lamps that flickered against velvet cushions. But like so many royal daughters across the globe, she lived within the walls of expectations built not for her happiness, but for the stability of the throne. Even now you can almost hear the hush of her chamber, the soft shuffle of silk slippers, the clink of a scent bottle on a mirrored tray, the muffled voices of attendants outside speaking of her, not as a woman, but as a symbol, a figure in a lineage, a name in the log. When she died in 1626, Ruqayya was buried in Agra, her tomb near that of Shah Jahan's beloved wife, Mumtaz Mahal. No towering dome marked her resting place. No monument spoke her grief. Just a quiet stone and the long exhale of a life spent watching others rise, reign, and be remembered. And yet, in the perfume of court traditions, in the quiet shaping of a future emperor's early soul, in the way her story still ripples softly through the pages of dusty Persian manuscripts, she lingers. Not every queen needs a child to leave a legacy, and not every woman born to power needs to shout to be heard. You pause here for just a breath. The night is deepening, but the story, it's just beginning to shift. And now, as the perfume of the Mughal harem fades behind you, a different quiet begins to settle. The night deepens as you move eastward once again, this time to a land of painted screens and misted pine forests. The palace no longer smells of rosewater, but of ink, pressed mulberry paper, and dried ginseng. You're walking now beneath the sloped eaves of a Joseon dynasty court, where everything is arranged with such care, mathematically perfect, like a Confucian diagram carved into time. And within this rigid order lived royal daughters breathing carefully behind silk fans, their fates folded as tightly as their sleeves. Officially, Korea's Joseon dynasty discouraged cousin marriage. In fact, by the 15th century, the Gyeongguk Daejeon, the state law code, prohibited marriage between close blood relatives, even extending that definition beyond what many other cultures considered. The court claimed purity through distance, A legal wall, one might say, against the mistakes of Europe and the Mughal court. But of course, as with many elegant rules, the truth lived in exceptions, especially among the Yangban elite, the aristocratic scholar class, and the royal family. Here's the thing about dynasties laws often bent beneath the weight of bloodline anxiety, and so while commoners were publicly restricted, high-ranking noble houses quietly arranged matches between cousins, particularly when a noble line teetered on extinction, or a powerful in-law faction needed to remain entrenched. The royal family, too, had its whispered arrangements. After all, the king's bloodline was believed to be sacred, and allowing it to mix too freely, especially with families not fully loyal to the throne, was a political risk few were willing to take. You imagine one such daughter now seated on the polished floor of a quiet chamber, staring at her reflection in a brass mirror. Her name might be Princess Huahyop, one of the lesser-known daughters of the late Joseon period. She came from impeccable lineage, her father, a prince, her mother, from a powerful family. Her marriage was not to a stranger from the provinces, but to a cousin, someone the family could trust, someone with proper blood. On paper it made sense. In practice it brought shadows that no candle could dispel. She died young, as many royal daughters did. The records do not linger on her symptoms. They say things like her health declined or she became quiet and pale. Court physicians prescribed decoctions of deer antler and jujube, but they had no diagnosis. There was no concept of recessive genes or hereditary disorders. There was only silence, and behind the silence loss, the pattern repeats more than once. Royal daughters who failed to thrive, young women who married well on paper, but faded in body and spirit in the margins of court records. One document refers to a family illness passed quietly between generations. Another to a princess unfit for childbirth, though she was only 16. Historians still argue whether these were isolated tragedies or part of a larger unspoken trend. Perhaps malnutrition, perhaps trauma, perhaps a bloodline too closely knit. But the court, so obsessed with outward appearance, rarely acknowledged any crack in the porcelain. You see, in Joseon Korea, everything was about face, surface harmony, perfect decorum, unbroken lineage charts displayed in ancestral shrines. A daughter's weakness could not be weakness. It had to be rephrased. Illness became melancholy. Barrenness became devotion. And early death became a sigh from the heavens. And yet inside the walls the women knew. They heard the same names repeated in memorial rites. They watched younger sisters pale too soon, their hair thinned by tonics that promised strength. They whispered among themselves during embroidery lessons, asking quietly if it might be different if they had married outside the circle. Some did. A handful of Joseon princesses were allowed to marry commoners, or at least military officials of lesser status. These rare matches sometimes brought longer lives, healthier children. But even those unions came at a cost. Such daughters lost their court titles and were often shunned during family ceremonies. They might live longer, but they lived apart. In a world where harmony meant obedience and belonging, that distance cut deep. And here's where a strange little tidbit slips through the gates in the late 1600s, during the reign of King Sukjong. One royal daughter who suffered from chronic illness was prescribed a rather bizarre treatment. She was advised to wear a warm silk pouch, filled with roasted silkworm cocoons tied to her lower back for 30 days. The court physician believed it would absorb cold from the blood. Whether or not it worked is lost to history, but it does paint a picture, one of a world that could recognize suffering, but not understand it. You sit with that image for a moment. A young girl, no more than 15, walking carefully through the palace, with a fragrant cocoon pouch pressed to her back, head bowed under the weight of expectation. Her brothers are being groomed for office. Her father is at court debating border conflicts. And she is asked to bear her lineage with grace, preferably in silence. Still, not all of them disappeared. A few left behind letters, diaries, even poems. Princess Jongmyong, though, from an earlier generation, wrote extensively in Hangul, the native Korean script, about the pressures of court life. She grieved not only her father's death, but the way women were treated like pawns in rituals they barely understood. Her writings survive not because they were preserved with care, but because a loyal attendant smuggled them into a family shrine after her passing. Sometimes history is saved not by scribes, but by love. By the end of the Joseon era, the court would gradually shift away from cousin marriages, especially as Western medical ideas trickled into Korea through missionaries and trade. But the damage done in earlier centuries was not easily undone. Some family lines bore the scars in fragile children, others in silent tombs with no descendants to tend the rites. And for the daughters, those marks rarely appeared in the histories. Instead, they were etched in disappearing ink, readable only if you knew where to look. As you tiptoe forward, the path begins to wind again. The air takes on the scent of cloves and cardamom, the sounds of oud strings playing in some distant hall. You've walked the silk floors of Joseon palaces long enough. Now it's time to visit another world where power, too, was often held by women who bore both glory and silence. The Ottomans await. Tonight you drift farther east, away from the frosted courtyards of Joseon Korea, beyond the winding alleys of Mughal palaces, and into a different kind of silence. The silence of Ottoman marble, of shadowed corridors behind ornate latticework of footsteps, softened by thick Persian rugs and unspoken truths. Istanbul doesn't sleep easily, not even in the 1500s. But the harem does, or at least it tries. You arrive not with fanfare, but with a whisper, a rustle of silk, a flicker of rose oil on the breeze. The Ottoman court, unlike the European ones you've tiptoed through before, didn't often bind itself with cousin marriage. The empire had its own approach, a pragmatic one. Sultans rarely married at all. They took consorts, often enslaved women raised and educated in the palace, so no single family could claim legitimacy through the womb. And yet, even here, even in this carefully balanced machine of governance and tradition, there were moments when politics drew the bloodline too tightly together. You settle beside a carved stone fountain in the gardens of Topkapi Palace. It's twilight. The pomegranate trees lean heavy with fruit, and a single peacock drags its tail along the gravel path. And just beyond that, behind an ironwood door carved with floral vines, lived a woman whose story folded quietly into the architecture. Her name, Ismihan Sultan. She was the daughter of Sultan Selim II, granddaughter of Suleiman the Magnificent, niece to the reigning sultan at the time. She was noble, intelligent, and perhaps most importantly strategically placed. In a court forever maneuvering among foreign threats, religious tensions and internal rivalries, she became an answer to a question no one wanted to ask aloud. What happens when you need loyalty, and no ally outside the palace can be trusted? The answer was arranged quietly. She married her uncle. It sounds jarring, even grotesque, but to the Ottoman elite it was a move of necessity, not desire. Her uncle was a high-ranking official past his youth, with no real claim to the throne. But he was reliable, loyal, contained, and marrying Ismihan to him ensured that her immense dowry and any children she might bear would remain tightly enclosed within the dynasty. You picture her on her wedding day, not in white, but in deep emerald silk embroidered with silver cypress trees. The palace musicians played softly. The courtiers bowed low. There was no scandal, no whispers, only ceremony. Because in this world, daughters of sultans were never fully people. They were promises, currency, locks forged to keep kingdoms closed against outside hands. Still, something of her remains. Ismihan Sultan was educated more than most women of her rank. She wrote poetry, oversaw a mosque built in her name, and according to court records, she suffered from fainting spells and unsettled breath later in life. The court physicians prescribed a strange remedy, a bath of rosewater infused with ice from Mount Ulada meant to stabilize her inner winds. It's here in the hushed alcoves of Ottoman medicine that you find your tidbit, a detail preserved like amber, in an otherwise sterile record. That cold rosewater baths were once considered an elite treatment for royal women's inheritance ailments. The logic chill the blood seal, the humors keep unwanted ancestral influences at bay. You imagine her lowering herself into that freezing bath heart, pounding attendants, averting their eyes the smell of roses, rising like a memory she couldn't place. Historians still debate whether Ismihan's condition was rooted in genetics or stress, or perhaps both. After all, in a world where royal daughters were pawns to policy, what could be more exhausting than being valuable, especially when that value came with no voice? Her story, however, is not the only one. In the records of Topkapa's later decades, you find another name, or rather the absence of one. A young woman listed only as daughter of the line, born to a high-ranking prince, and a favored concubine married off to a cousin in a distant provincial court. She vanishes by age 22. No death record, no child. Only a physician's note, persistent shaking, melancholia, and a directive to discontinue all goat milk, which was thought to inflame the nerves. And what happened to her? We don't know, but we can guess. The Ottomans didn't embrace inbreeding the way the Habsburgs did, but they weren't immune to it. In times of internal crisis, rebellion, succession disputes, factional strife, the courts sometimes pulled its daughters closer. Cousin marriages weren't standard, but they weren't unheard of either. A way to shore up loyalty, to contain rival claims, to keep the empire from fracturing like glass. The tragedy is not that these daughters were married off. It's that they were erased when the price became too obvious. Infertility must be the evil eye. Depression. Just a sensitive temperament. No heirs, blame the stars. Blame the mother's diet. Never the bloodline. Never the marriage. You begin to understand something sitting there in the quiet of the garden. The Ottoman system tried to avoid the mistakes of Europe by scattering the roots of its royal tree. But even scattered roots can tangle, and in rare silent cases they did. And yet there is a strange softness here too. Unlike the rigid expectations placed on European princesses, some Ottoman royal women lived long lives inside the palace, free from political marriages. They governed the harem, commissioned architecture, wrote, taught, survived. The system was no paradise, but it wasn't entirely a prison either. By the 17th century, internal marriages grew rarer still. The court had learned, slowly, quietly, through whispers and veiled funerals and daughters who never made it past 20. Foreign mothers became the norm again, and with them a wider genetic pool and a slightly safer fate for future daughters. But for Ismihan Sultan and the others like her, it was too late. So tonight, as the moon rises over the Bosphorus, and the call to prayer echoes across Istanbul's 7 hills, you sit in that invisible space between memory and silence. You hold for just a moment the weight of a decision made centuries ago, to marry a daughter to her uncle, not for love, not even for blood, but for the illusion of control. And you remember her, in emerald silk, in freezing water, in a palace that demanded everything and gave her nothing in return. You awaken again not to the damp chill of a European castle, or the smoky hush of an Ottoman courtyard, but to a silence so absolute it could be mistaken for peace. The air smells of ink and sandalwood. Tatami mats press coolly against your knees, and through the paper walls of your room, the low hum of a bamboo water fountain breaks the stillness every few seconds. Tick, tick, tick. You are in the heart of Kyoto, though the year is far earlier than the guidebooks will ever tell you. This is Heian, Japan, and tonight you are not merely a visitor. You are a daughter, and not just any daughter, but one born into the most powerful family in the land, the Fujiwara. At first glance it seems gentle here. No shouting, no swordplay. Courtiers float past you in layered silk robes, their blackened teeth peeking out as they murmur verses of poetry. Women write in diaries so delicately that entire lifetimes pass between the lines. There is beauty in every corner. Lacquered screens, gold-leafed fans, and moon viewing platforms that seem designed for dreams. But don't be fooled. Behind the grace is a trap, finely woven and airless, one so polite it never even calls itself a prison. The Fujiwara clan did not seize power through conquest. They did something far more elegant and far more permanent. They married their daughters to emperors. Again and again, for generation after generation, Fujiwara girls became imperial consorts, and their sons became emperors. Their fathers, grandfathers, and uncles were regents, advisors, and ministers, not because they were crowned, but because they controlled the cradles. You were born into this strategy. Your father has already selected the scrolls. You'll study the poems. You'll memorize the layers of silk you'll learn to wrap and unwrap with practiced modesty. You think these things will make you refined, but they are preparation not for freedom but for fertility. You exist quite literally to be a mother of the throne. No one says this aloud, of course. Here everything is dressed in ritual and metaphor. When your cousin marries an emperor, it's not called strategy, it's called fate. When your own engagement is arranged to a man twice your age who happens to be your uncle's son, it is spoken of as harmony. These pairings are not always labeled incestuous in the way Europeans might define the term, but the result is the same. A narrowing of the bloodline, a tightening of options, a family tree that curves back into itself like a circle drawn too many times in the sand. At night you sleep with your face turned toward the wall. The inner chambers of the palace are so quiet. The only sound is the scratching of a brush on paper, as one of the ladies-in-waiting records the day's rituals. The air is perfumed with camellia oil, but your stomach is tight. There have been whispers another miscarriage in the north wing. Another consort sent away for recovery only to return paler and more silent than before. They never say what's wrong. The court physicians describe things in terms of wind imbalance or spiritual dampness. But the older women know. You see it in the way they press their lips together, in the prayers they slip into their sleeves when no one is looking. Too many daughters of the same line, too many sons of cousins. The blood that once gave the Fujiwara their unshakable claim is beginning to weigh heavy, not in scandal, but in stillbirths, in exhaustion, in girls like you who carry expectations thicker than their own names. One fact remains unavoidable, even as it's cloaked in delicate euphemism. For over 2 centuries, the Fujiwara dominated the imperial court not through conquest, but by ensuring that nearly every empress consort and imperial mother came from their own family. These were not occasional marriages of convenience. They were deliberate, sustained insertions of Fujiwara daughters into the bloodline, often to men only distantly or not so distantly related. The court's genealogies might trace the names back neatly, but no amount of brushwork can smooth out the knots in the family's actual genetic code. No one paints portraits of sickly children here, but the records are clear in what they don't say. Empresses who died young, sons who never reigned, girls who entered the palace and left without ever speaking again. The phrase delicate constitution is used often and never questioned. You learn to keep your voice soft. You learn that grief must be folded like a kimono and hidden in drawers lined with cedar. You hear of one girl who gave birth to 3 stillborn children in a row, her rooms ritually purified each time her body blamed quietly, but relentlessly. After the 3rd, she was sent to a remote temple to recover her balance. She never returned. And yet, even amid this quiet pressure, you notice things. A tiny ritual nearly forgotten now, in which a midwife places a bowl of water next to the laboring mother and watches for any ripples, believing that the unborn child's spirit might disturb the surface. or another in which women were made to chew dried plum blossoms during pregnancy, thought to cleanse the breath and thus protect the baby's purity. Strange, yes. But in a world where no one dared speak of broken bloodlines, superstition became a way to whisper what science had no name for. You begin to understand that the Fujiwara system was not simply about closeness to the emperor, it was about closeness to control. And control always comes at a cost. The more they tightened the circle, the more fragile their daughters became. Not visibly, not scandalously, but quietly. In a palace where everything is silent, it's easy to mistake stillness for strength. The women themselves are not weak, not the girl who wrote verse by lantern light, even after her third miscarriage. Not the one who asked the shrine maidens to burn her baby's clothes in a cedar fire, saying only that she wanted the smoke to carry her love upward. Not even you who lie awake at night wondering if your own body is already betraying the dynasty. You hear that things are shifting. A young emperor, just a boy, has chosen a consort not of Fujiwara blood. A scandal, yes, but also a breeze through a stifled room. Maybe in some future generation the trap will loosen. Maybe daughters will be chosen for joy, not for lineage. Maybe, but not for you. For now you rise before the sun, offer incense. Press your forehead to the floor and smile as your tutor praises the elegance of your calligraphy. You are the daughter of a line that has ruled without ever wearing the crown. Your robes are heavier than they look. Your name may never appear in any textbook. But tonight, as history breathes softly over your shoulder, you are not forgotten. You are remembered layer by silken layer. By now you've floated through many courts. Some smelled of rosewater, some of sandalwood, and some simply of dust and silence. But now, as you settle into the final decades of the 1500s, you find yourself in a European palace once again, though which one exactly becomes harder to tell. The tapestries begin to blend together. The portraits blur at the edges. And more curiously still, the faces in those portraits begin to resemble one another, eerily so. You blink, then look again. That noblewoman in Madrid, she has the same sloping forehead as the princess in Vienna. And that young bride in Brussels, wide as her nose, seemed to echo the emperor's, the jawlines, the cheekbones, even the weary eyes. It's as if the same girl has been painted over and over, only in different brocade. You're not imagining things. By the late 1500s, the royal families of Europe had become something like a hall of mirrors, each generation reflecting back the last, only a little more blurred, a little more fragile, a little more trapped. What began as strategy dynastic consolidation, political alliances keeping land and legacy in the family, had quietly transformed into something deeper, something harder to undo. The royal family tree, once expansive, had become a bramble, and in its thorns lived daughters born not just of royalty, but of repeated proximity. Their names change, Margarita, Catalina, Renee, Anna, but the pattern does not. These girls are born into lineage as if it were destiny, and into bloodlines so tangled that your cousin might also be your niece, and your betrothed might be your uncle twice over. In one particularly convoluted case, a Habsburg bride was simultaneously her husband's first cousin and his great-niece. The wedding still went on, of course, with great celebration. It's hard to cancel destiny when it's stitched into so many banners. At first, these marriages seem elegant unions of great houses, ceremonies conducted under gilded arches, watched by nobles in fur-trimmed sleeves. But beneath the surface, something uneasy brews. You see it in the way infants are born with fragile lungs, in the swelling of joints, the slurred speech that lingers long after childhood, in the uncanny quietness of certain daughters who never speak above a whisper, not because they are docile, but because it hurts too much to be seen. You are one of them now born into this thicket of lineage. Your governess insists you memorize your family tree, but it spirals back on itself like ivy with no wall. You recognize the same names in every generation, Charles Joanna Ferdinand looping endlessly like a church bell that never stops ringing. You begin to understand that you don't belong to a family. You belong to a system. And systems, unlike people, don't bend for tired daughters. In the portrait room, you sit for your likeness. The artist tries to flatter you, but you catch his hesitation. Your jaw isn't quite symmetrical. Your lips sit slightly off-center. It's not your fault, and not your mother's either. It's just the way the line has curled back too many times. You hear someone joke too close to earshot that the Habsburg look now comes standard with the crown. You don't laugh. The Habsburg jaw, of course, is the most famous of these inherited features. Its extreme underbite so pronounced that some royal heirs struggle to eat properly or speak clearly. It became a symbol of dynasty, yes, but also of warning, a visual reminder of what happens when nature is asked to follow maps drawn by monarchs. But the jaw was not alone. There were hidden effects too, genetic diseases that made movement painful, reduced fertility, and in more than one case led to early death, cloaked under the phrase delicate health. And yet the portraits keep coming. Each generation commissions more as if to prove their lineage is intact, their daughters radiant, their heirs inevitable. You sit beside your cousin during Mass and realize your faces are almost interchangeable. Even the tilt of your heads feels rehearsed. A courtesan whispers behind her fan that you two could be twins. You both smile politely. You both know better. You once heard a curious tale tucked in the corners of an old dowry ledger that a Spanish infanta born in the 1570s was so indistinguishable from her cousin that they were briefly switched in a courtly procession, and no one noticed for hours. Whether true or not, the story lingers. It says something deeper than it intends. These girls, these royal daughters, had become interchangeable, visibly similar, politically identical, marriageable units. And if one failed well, there was always another with the same blood. You sometimes wonder if this sameness gave them comfort. After all, what is loneliness when your face is already familiar in every mirror? But the sameness had its shadows too. You could not escape. There were no distant cousins to marry for love, no foreign lands to disappear into. Everyone you knew was tied to you by blood or by contract, or often both. Your options were not yours. And yet you dreamed, quietly beneath your veil. You dreamed of a face that was different, of a child who might have her own voice, not one inherited from 4 generations of uncles. But even that was a gamble. You had seen what happened when the line folded in too tightly, children born too soon or not at all, girls who lived only a few months, sons whose eyes never quite focused. And you had also seen what happened to the mothers. They were not blamed, not openly, but they were set aside, quietly replaced, quietly erased. Historians still debate whether the Habsburg dynasty's insistence on intra-family marriage was based purely on politics, or whether it became habit, an inertia of custom, too heavy to redirect. Some argue it was a calculated preservation of bloodlines. Others say it was fear of losing control, of diluting claim. But either way, the cost was the same, and it was paid in bodies, not balance sheets. In one dusty account book from a minor court, you once found a curious note. A payment to a jeweler for 2 identical lockets each with the same miniature painted inside. The inscription simply read, "So she need never forget her place." The portraits, it seems, were not just for history. They were reminders. You are this, and only this. But you are not just this. In the solitude of the chapel, when no one watches you, let your shoulders fall. You press your forehead to the cold stone, not to pray for a husband or a son, but just for something to break the circle. You wonder if the child inside you, if there is one, will carry your face, or your mother's, or your cousin's, or something else entirely. You wonder if she will ever know what it feels like to walk into a room and not see her own features reflected back from every wall. Later that evening, you sit again for a portrait. The painter asks which style you prefer, something traditional perhaps, or more modern. You surprise him. You ask for your face as it is. No flattering, no softening of the chin. Let it show, all of it. If you must be remembered, let it be honestly. As the brush moves slow and deliberate, you feel something loosen, not in the paint, but in the silence around you. Maybe the curse isn't the face itself. Maybe it's the idea that it must always be the same. You sit for the portrait one final time, not because you need another painting, but because everyone else has one, and you've long stopped expecting choice. The studio smells of varnish and violets, and the painter's brush trembles slightly in his fingers. He tries to hide it. He has painted many women who look just like you, perhaps too many, and yet something has changed. You feel it not in the courts, not yet, but in the silences between rituals, the growing pause before engagements, the wary glances exchanged across banquet tables. The golden centuries of inbreeding, so proudly preserved for dynasties, are showing wear. Heirs are fewer, infant deaths mount. Even the most stubborn monarchs begin to worry, not for love, not for health, but for continuity. Because even empires must breed to endure. As the 1600s unfurl and the 1700s tiptoe in your descendants, find themselves at a crossroads. There are fewer eligible relatives, and fewer still who aren't already tangled in the family knot. Papal dispensations still trickle in. Yes, but quietly, almost sheepishly now. Doctors newly emboldened by anatomy books and private experiments begin whispering theories about blood, about inheritance, about the dangers of marrying too close. And somewhere between superstition and science, a reckoning begins. You don't live to see it, but your great-granddaughter does. Her name is Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna, but history will remember her as Marie Antoinette. She is a child of Habsburg blood, yes, but the chain is beginning to thin. Her jaw is lighter, her limbs more limber. Still, she carries your ghost. In her portrait, yes, another one, you recognize the tilt of the head, the trained smile. But her eyes are watchful, not weary. Historians still debate when the curse of dynastic inbreeding truly broke. Was it the final collapse of the Spanish Habsburg line in 1700 when Charles II died childless, and reportedly so physically frail that he could barely chew? Was it the marriage reforms that slowly spread across Europe in the 18th century, limiting papal dispensations for close unions? Or was it simply exhaustion, political, medical, emotional, that convinced monarchs to seek new blood beyond their own gates? No matter the reason, the result was clear by the late 1700s. Cousin marriages in royal Europe were no longer default. They still occurred, oh yes, but with greater caution and greater consequence. Courts began seeking alliances, not just among themselves, but among the rising nobility, even the wealthy bourgeoisie. Blue blood diluted perhaps, but with it came fresh breath, and children who could run without pain and speak without effort. You might imagine that this brought only relief. But it wasn't so simple. In the quiet corners of palaces, the scars remained. Daughters born into the final echoes of the bloodline curse still bore its marks. Some couldn't bear children. Others suffered what the doctors called hysteria. But you recognize it for what it is, the invisible strain of generations carried in silence. Even when their features softened, their lives were still shaped by the shadows of what came before. There is a letter, half faded now, from a Bavarian duchess in 1783. She writes to her sister, "I dream often that I am two people at once, myself and the woman, whose name I do not know, but whose sorrow I feel. No one remembers her name, but her words ring with centuries of recognition." And there were other echoes, too. In Austria, for instance, it became fashionable among certain archduchesses to wear lockets not of their husbands, but of their maternal ancestors. Inside was often a scrap of lace, a curl of hair, or in one case a tiny stitched replica of a crooked jaw, meant to remind them quietly of the price their foremothers had paid. That was the tidbit you hadn't expected, wasn't it? Not a scandal, but a quiet homage, a noblewoman carrying a miniature embroidered deformity, not out of shame but of memory. Even as science gained ground, superstition clung. Midwives murmured prayers to protect babies from inherited blood sadness. Physicians advised cool rooms and light diets for expectant royal mothers, believing delicacy might undo what generations had done. And though theories of heredity were still foggy, the connection between blood and suffering was now impossible to ignore. Still, not all families turned away at once. In some courts, the old instincts lingered. In 19th century Portugal, for instance, there remained pockets of dynastic unions that echoed the Habsburgs' old patterns. One Queen Maria II married her uncle, just as Anna of Austria had centuries before. But unlike Anna Maria's children were not numerous, and many were sickly. The physicians kept quiet. The portraits remained flattering. But in private journals the truth flickered. You wonder perhaps what these women thought as they sat for their own portraits. Did they feel the echo of your bones? Did they trace the names on their family trees and pause at the same curves and crosses? Did they understand that they were the end not of glory, but of a line too tightly wound? You are far from alone now. The world has moved. And in that movement, your story has found space to breathe. The portraits, once stiff and somber, begin to show movement. A smile not quite controlled, a breeze fluttering through hair, a glimpse of laughter behind the eyes. It takes centuries, yes, but eventually royal daughters begin to look like people again. In Britain, Queen Victoria herself becomes a quiet symbol of this shift. She is of German descent, yes, and her own children marry back into the European dynasties, but the line begins to diversify. By the 20th century, genetic studies confirm what your bones always knew. Inbreeding leads not just to sameness, but to suffering. One study published discreetly in the 1990s reveals that the rate of inherited hemophilia in Queen Victoria's descendants was almost certainly due to a spontaneous genetic mutation, not inbreeding. A twist, yes, but one that reminds us how little choice these women had. Whether through blood or bad luck, the body bore the burden. You stretch out in bed now. The room is quiet. The curtains are soft. And though you know how much has been lost, you also feel how much has shifted. You were not born to change the system. You were born within it. And still you carried something forward, if not through your children, then through your silence, your strength, your remembering. Not every curse ends with a bang. Sometimes it ends with a long sigh, with a daughter who finally says no, or a mother who finally tells the truth, or a scribe, yes, maybe one like me who writes down the stories no one else thought to keep. The portraits are still here, but now when people pass them, they don't just say, "What a pretty girl." They ask what was her story. They wonder what she dreamed of, who she might have been had she been born just a few generations later. And in that wondering you are restored, not as an emblem, not as a lesson, but as a person. You wake to silence again, but this time it feels different. Not the echoing kind that presses against your ribs and reminds you of all you weren't allowed to say. This is a stillness that holds room for breath, for memory, for something more than just survival. You have spent your life preparing for duties that were assigned to you before your first tooth appeared. You were molded into a jewel, flawless on the outside, but brittle beneath the pressure. And yet somehow you endured. Your name may not appear in textbooks. Your portrait might hang crooked in a forgotten corridor, or perhaps not at all. But that doesn't mean you vanished. Because every time a researcher squints at an old genealogy chart and wonders why 5 daughters died before reaching adulthood, they remember you. Every time someone stands in front of a weathered cradle in a palace nursery and imagines a life too short for records, they remember you. Not for your marriage, not for your dowry, but for the quiet power of your being. In many ways, your story was designed to be disposable. You were born to serve a pattern, not to break it. And yet the cracks you left tiny as they were let light in for those who came after. The strange thing about legacy is that it often starts with forgetting. You were the third daughter, perhaps, or the one born during a season of political unrest. No one expected your name to echo. And yet here we are, centuries later, listening, wondering, piecing together the silent sighs between royal proclamations. Your life was stitched into the fabric of a dynasty, but the threads you left behind belonged to something older than bloodlines, something more human. Historians still argue about how much agency royal daughters really had. Some claim you were merely pawns. Others insist that even within the tightest cages, women like you found ways to bend iron bars. Letters hidden in hems, glances exchanged across banquets, the subtle, radical act of withholding affection from a husband chosen for you. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the middle, not defiance, not surrender, but the steady act of enduring. One of the last women to bear the full weight of this legacy was Empress Zita of Bourbon-Parma, the last Empress of Austria-Hungary. She married into the Habsburg line in the early 1900s. Yes, even then the dynasty still echoed and gave birth to 8 children. 8. And yet after the collapse of the empire, she lived in exile, moving from country to country with quiet dignity. She was never crowned in the end, but she outlived the throne. That in itself is something. And here's your tidbit. Quiet, strange, and oddly touching among the royal keepsakes passed down through some branches of the Habsburg family was a lace-trimmed handkerchief said to have belonged to Maria Teresa. Not embroidered with flowers or initials, but with a tiny stitched outline of a uterus. Not an artistic rendering, but an anatomical one. Hand-drawn first, then replicated in thread. A whispered reminder of the true engine of dynasties, and of the cost. You were not your womb, and yet it was often the only part of you that mattered to them. And now you are remembered for more, not just by historians, by writers, by mothers, by daughters, by the people who read between the lines and know that every kingdom rests on the backs of women whose stories were never written. You are remembered when someone visits an old palace and stops at the smallest bedchamber, wondering why the window was nailed shut. You are remembered when a little girl traces her finger along the painted jawline of a princess and notices the sadness in her eyes. You are remembered when someone like me sits down and writes quietly, respectfully, persistently, until your name breathes again. You were not weak. You were not forgotten. You were forced into a role, and still you made something human of it. And even if they never wrote your thoughts down, they echo through time anyway in lullabies, passed through generations in myths of the weeping queen, in superstitions about naming daughters after the ones who didn't survive. That is memory. That is presence. You didn't choose to be born into royal blood. You didn't choose the chin or the cousin groom, or the crown you couldn't escape. But tonight you are not alone in it. Tonight someone lies awake and listens to your life like a lullaby, not to fall asleep on you, but to hold you in stillness. And just like that, your story settles not as a tragedy, but as a truth. Not a warning, not a lesson, just a remembering. You wonder what your life could have been had you been allowed to grow outside the shadow of dynasties. Not in a marble palace, but maybe in a quiet cottage, with wild herbs on the windowsill and laughter at the table. Not with brocade and jewels, but with freedom of thought. Freedom to love, freedom to stay unremarkable. You imagine just for a moment what it might have been like to choose. But you didn't get to. What you did get was something else. Something less visible, but no less real. You held the line. You kept the tapestry from unraveling. You absorbed the burden not just of your family's name, but of history's silence. And in doing so, you left something behind. In the genealogy charts, with too many arrows looping inward in the portraits that grew sadder and paler, With every generation, there is still something of you that endures. A softness. A suggestion that maybe strength isn't always loud. Maybe survival in itself was an act of quiet rebellion. So now, centuries later, we do what your court painters and chroniclers never did. We see you. Not just the mask of duty or the titles you bore, or the children you were expected to bear, but you. The girl you might have been. The woman you were not allowed to become. The legacy you didn't ask for, but carried anyway. And now, as we close the book on your story, we do not slam it shut. We set it down gently. We run our fingers over the cover. We remember. It's late now. The torches have burned low in the halls of memory, and the velvet drapes of old castles have settled into stillness. Outside your window, if there were a window, the moon would be high and gentle, casting silver over forgotten courtyards and overgrown garden paths. The kind of night that doesn't demand anything of you, just rest. You've traveled through time tonight, not to battles or coronations, but into bedrooms too cold and hearts too heavy. You've seen the faces behind the painted smiles, the women behind the dynasties, and maybe for just a moment you've sat beside them, not as a historian, not even as a guest, but as someone who listened. Their stories weren't meant to be told. They were meant to be worn down by silence. But here you are, holding them in your breath, tucking them beneath your pillow like a secret. That matters. So take a deep breath. You are not a pawn. You are not a contract. You are not the sum of someone else's inheritance. You are here. You are warm. You are free. And if the shadows of those old royal halls ever feel too close, too heavy, just remember you've already walked them. You made it through. And you came out not with a crown, but with clarity. Tonight's sleep belongs to you. Not to the kings, not to the popes, not to the family trees that bent and broke to keep a throne alive. Just you, breathing, resting, remembering. Good night, dear one.